All right, well, I'm sorry not to be able to be there with you at this conference. It's an amazing achievement over so many years for the Country Ed project. Um, when it began, of course, it was a Schools Commission initiative and it was supposed to be addressing the disadvantage of country kids. At first, the Schools Commission and Jean Blackburn wanted a survey of disadvantage, as they'd done with the whole disadvantaged schools program, but we basically said, look, we know really what the broad disadvantages are. They're isolated, often don't have access to the teachers in subjects they want, they don't have access to libraries, that sort of thing. So we took a completely different approach and we decided it had to be based on the idea of cooperation and sharing rather than funding individual schools, which couldn't be done, was too expensive and didn't make any sense. We said schools have to cooperate and share and build networks in their local community. Now, that was the first issue. You know, what's a local community? What's a local area? And we defined 5 areas in Victoria that were really not they were not areas, they weren't communities. They were lots of little country towns that had their own footy teams. They were rivals, the schools were rivals, the local councils didn't like one another. And so it was a big job to develop that sense of cooperation rather than funding separate individual schools. We said you get no money at all unless you develop programs that the schools across the entire area can share in. It was also a cooperative project between the state system, the Catholic system and the private system, because it was national funding. And that was unheard of too. You know, how on earth would Catholic schools cooperate with private schools and with the state system? And the programs were to be shared between primary and secondary schools. So the philosophy was really very straightforward, very simple. It was learning, education, is not just what happens in the school. Learning is really something that kids get from the whole community, from parents, from people in the community, from the media, the whole lot. And so that should be brought together in the program. It certainly was to say, don't just tell us what you lack, tell us what advantages you've got in those country areas. I remember Malcolm Fraser having a go at me at Casterton once, saying, oh, country people have all sorts of advantages. And I said, well, they do if you actually ask them and encourage them to build on those resources. So we said to these people in those areas, we're the planning committee and we're setting guidelines and we're the funding body, but we're not going to tell you what to do or how to do it. You've got to come up with that initiative at that local area level. So we had an area coordinator that they appointed, and we insisted that was not to be a school teacher. It had to be a community person. They had an area committee each. 50% of that committee had to be teachers, 50% had to be other people outside the schools, adults, business people, farmers, whatever, who had an interest in the quality of education for their kids. Now that was revolutionary and they didn't really understand it. Sometimes the school teachers opposed it, the school inspectors hated it. It was not to be centrally controlled, and we gradually sort of talked them around as they realised that the process was what was important rather than, you know, being dictated to by central bureaucrats or educationists. I mean, at various meetings I was called a bloody academic because I was at La Trobe University at the time, and then I was a bloody city academic, and then I was a bloody bureaucratic city academic, until finally, after many meetings in cold little halls and schools, they realised we meant what we were saying. We were saying, you decide what you need, but you also identify the resources in your local community that we can then build on with the limited funding the project had. So they did that, and you know, they said, well, we don't know how to do a survey, so we showed them how to do it. Ken Egan was the first executive officer, worked his butt off. We all went out from the planning committee. I had terrific people from the Education Ministry, the Catholic Education group, the private education group, they all locked into this philosophy that individual schools cannot educate kids on their own. You have to build on the whole community. So we even had trouble with the Schools Commission at one point because people like Joan Kerner insisted it was a schools project. It was a schools commission project. So the money had to be spent only on kids in schools. And we said, no. The wording is the money's to be spent in relation to the education of rural children. In relation to. And we felt if the parents, for example, couldn't read properly or couldn't talk to their kids properly or didn't understand what the teachers were about, then they had to be part of that education and learning process as well. And that's really what happened. So we had some amazing things. The attempt to get them to identify resources in the community took a lot of building and understanding, but of course they soon found there were people in their community who had been nurses, had been teachers, there were farmers with technical skills, there were musicians, there were artists, there were craftsmen. So when they said, look, in the Mallee Tracks area or in Far East Gippsland, there's no art, there's no teacher who can even play the guitar or blow the flute or whatever, we said, well, look for them. There are people in the community, perhaps. In one area, they located 1,000 musical instruments that were sitting idle in church halls and cupboards and farm homesteads and that sort of thing. And they also found 3 people, a couple of women and a bloke, who were musical. And they taught every kid a musical instrument right across that whole area. That led to little orchestras, little Eisteddfods, a whole new culture of music education. In another area, they wanted a technical school. Well, would have been millions to build a technical school. And we said, well, there's no money for that, but you can surely develop a technical program if you build on resources. Now there, they found local garages that were not being used. They had concrete floors, they had properly wired electricity. They found farmers with skills in saw sharpening, electrical techniques. They then drew in, for example, the Horsham TAFE College, people who'd come out to the small towns and they'd run technical skills programs for the kids during the day and for the adults, drawing on the skills of other adults at night. So that's the way it worked. It was building on the resources, saying to people, you're not deprived, disadvantaged, you're not inferior, you've got the ability to develop an education program for your own kids in your own way, and if you come up with a program that shares and can meet a real need, then the limited funding that we as the planning committee could provide would be added to what they were already doing in the schools. Now to me it's the only way to go. You cannot have individual schools hanging on to their resources. One might have a good accounting teacher, another one hasn't. One might have a good music teacher, another hasn't. If you can't share that, particularly now with online techniques, with the internet and so on, Skype, why on earth can't we build on that cooperation across whole areas to build up and extend the quality of learning in country schools? They are disadvantaged because of distance. They are disadvantaged because they don't have a local library the kids can go to easily. I myself, I grew up in Warrnambool. I was going to be a science person, but in matric that year the science teachers left, the chemistry teacher left, the physics teacher left, so lo and behold I had to switch to arts and humanities, and that was a good thing. It led to my entire career in research and families and sociology and that sort of thing. But at the time I was really upset. I felt deprived. I didn't have the advantage some of my mates had to go to Melbourne and study science. Now many kids in country towns are still facing that dilemma, and if you focus just on the one school and the one group of teachers and only the teachers, where can you go? Whereas if you use resources in an economical fashion, don't just pour the money out to separate individual schools, but get them to cooperate and to network, you can produce amazing quality results, which is what the Country Education Project was all about.